In November 1949, Major Warren Lewis, brother of C.S. Lewis, wrote what was probably the first ever review of J.R.R. Tolkien's novel The Lord of the Rings. The manuscript he had read was in an inchoate state. It did not even have a title, but this new Hobbit, the long-awaited sequel to Tolkien's 1937 children's story of that name, had captivated Lewis immediately. "Golly, what a book! The inexhaustible fertility of the man's imagination amazes me," Lewis enthused in his diary. He was struck by Tolkien's mastery of description, his poignant characterizations, and the unflagging energy of the narrative. This, he felt, was a great book of its kind. Lewis wondered, though, if critics would interpret The Lord of the Rings as a political satire about contemporary Europe, rather than as the timeless, mythopoeic fantasy that Tolkien had intended to write. By accident, a great deal of it can be read topically, Lewis thought, the Shire standing for England, Rohan for France, Gondor, the Germany of the future, Sauron for Stalin. He even wondered if the egregious Louis Silkin, the Minister of Town and Country Planning in Clement Attlee's Labour government, would be identified as the Vandal wizard Saruman, destroyer of the novel's pastoral idyll, the Shire. None of this would have pleased Tolkien. In 1965, in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, he explicitly rejected the idea that his story was intended as an allegory of any historical event, most of all the recent Great War against Nazism. "The real war does not resemble the legendary war in its process or its conclusion," Tolkien insisted. Even so, for all such protestations, Lewis had clearly been onto something back in 1949. He had realized that Tolkien's future audience was going to see associations between events in Middle-earth and those in their own world. But then Tolkien himself, in his 1965 foreword, conceded that the absence of any deliberately embedded allegory did not preclude his readers' right to interpret the text as they saw fit. The Lord of the Rings might not serve as an allegory, but it had what he called applicability. Tolkien had, after all, never made any secret of the fact that the Shire, the setting of the first 4 and final 2 chapters of The Lord of the Rings, was modelled on the rural Warwickshire he half remembered from his childhood in the 1890s. Even the Shire's location, on the northwestern edge of Middle-earth, correlated with the usual placement of the British Isles on the map of Europe. The Shire, with its dry stone walls, hay-wains, country ale-houses, and sheriffs, was an affectionate parody of the pre-industrial deep England, already central to conservative, especially Catholic conservative, conceptions of English identity at the beginning of the 20th century, through the writings of authors such as G.K. Chesterton, H.J. Massingham, and H.V. Morton. And the Shire's diminutive inhabitants, hobbits, charming, absurd, helpless hobbits, as Gandalf the Wizard calls them, corresponded very neatly with the gentle and unassuming self-image that the English people had adopted for themselves in the years after the First World War. They had not always seen themselves as such meek creatures. The brash, bumptious ogre John Bull, the personification of English virtues, who had symbolized the age of high Britannic imperialism and gunboat diplomacy, was no hobbit. But, after the slaughter of the Western Front, the English were weary of John Bull's aggressive theatricality. Now they saw themselves exemplified by the little man, small, kindly, bewildered, modest, obstinate, and very lovable, as the writer and MP Harold Nicholson described him, and most famously depicted by the cartoonist Sidney Stroob in the Daily Express, with bowler hat, umbrella, bow tie, high collar, pince-nez glasses, and bushy white moustache. Stroob's little man offered an Englishman for a new, milder, altogether more quotidian age. Writing in 1934, the conservative historian Arthur Bryant argued that this modern little Englishman was a stolid, tolerant, good-humoured, reliable kind of person, so strong withal, because he is so much at peace with himself, so gentle. W.R. Inge, a former dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, said of him that he was humane, Cruelty excites him to violent indignation. He is a bad hater and has a short memory for injuries. His chief vices were intemperance, in eating more than drinking, and a disinclination for hard and steady work. But he made up for these faults by a peculiar sense of humour, preserving him from fierce and cruel fanaticisms. Tolkien, writing a few years later, would describe his hobbits as an unobtrusive but very ancient people who loved peace and quiet and good-tilled earth, whose faces were as a rule good-natured rather than beautiful, broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked, and who found pleasure mainly in eating and drinking and simple jests. Clearly the English were the close cousins of these artless, introverted, and complacent people of the Shire,